We had only owned the mountain cabin for a week when my wife decided to change the lock on the front door. It was nothing fancy, just a basic deadbolt from the hardware store, but for us it meant peace of mind. The old one looked worn and flimsy, and since we planned to spend weekends here, she wanted to be sure we were the only ones with access. As she crouched on the porch, screwdriver in hand, a pair of neighbors wandered by, watching her work with suspicious eyes. One of them muttered something about community regulations and HO approval required. But my wife, practical as ever, didn't bother to respond. She finished the job, tested the key, and gave me a satisfied nod. Not an hour later, as we carried boxes from the car, the rumble of engines announced unexpected company. 2 sheriff's cruisers pulled into the gravel drive, their lights off but their presence unmistakable. Behind them, the HOA president stood at the edge of the road, arms crossed, radiating self-importance. He looked like a man who had just pulled a power move and was waiting for applause. The deputies approached us with cautious professionalism, asking if there had been any unauthorized alterations to the property. My wife straightened, dusted her hands on her jeans, and raised an eyebrow at the question. Changing a lock, she asked, her voice calm, almost amused. The officers glanced at each other, unsure how to answer, so she reached into her jacket and produced a leather case. With one smooth motion, she flipped it open to reveal her badge. The effect was immediate. The deputies froze, their posture shifting as recognition registered. They were talking to a fellow law enforcement officer, one whose authority went beyond county lines. The HOA president's smug expression crumbled. His lips parted, but no words came out. Whatever righteous indignation he'd prepared dissolved into silence. The deputies cleared their throats, apologized to my wife for the inconvenience, and assured us that we were well within our rights to secure our own property. They retreated quickly, leaving the president to stew in his own embarrassment. He gave us a weak nod, then disappeared down the road without another word. From that day forward, no one in the neighborhood so much as mentioned locks, paint colors, or any other trivial rule to us. The cabin stayed quiet, peaceful, and very much ours, the way my wife had intended when she turned that screwdriver the very first day. Settling into the cabin, still in the middle of unloading boxes and stacking them in the living room. I had gone back outside to grab another load when I noticed the crunch of gravel from down the road. 2 sheriff's cruisers were easing their way up the drive, dust trailing behind them. At first, I thought maybe there'd been an accident nearby, or perhaps they'd come to introduce themselves since law enforcement sometimes checked on cabins in the off-season. But then I saw him, our HOA president, standing stiffly on the roadside like a general watching his troops. His arms were folded, his chest puffed out, and the smug smile on his face said everything this was his doing. The deputies climbed out of their vehicles, their boots sinking into the gravel. But they weren't hostile, but they had that official air that meant they expected trouble. One of them greeted us politely and explained they'd received a call about unauthorized changes to property. The phrase hung awkwardly in the air, as if even he wasn't sure it sounded like a legitimate problem. My wife was just coming down the steps with a box in her hands when she caught the tail end of his explanation. She paused, looked at the officers, then at the HOA president glaring from behind them, and raised an eyebrow in disbelief. Unauthorized changes, she repeated. You mean the lock? The officers exchanged a quick glance, then nodded slightly. They seemed almost embarrassed to be there. It was clear they hadn't expected to spend their afternoon questioning new homeowners over a deadbolt. But procedure demanded they ask, so they stood waiting, their hands resting on their belts, trying to look composed. My wife set down her box carefully on the porch and stepped closer, calm and deliberate. There was no defensiveness in her tone, No panic, just a quiet authority. She explained, in the simplest terms, that she'd changed the lock for safety, nothing more. As she spoke, I noticed the HOA president shifting, ready to pounce on some technicality. He looked so certain that this was his moment, that he had caught us in violation of some sacred rule, and that the deputies were there to put us in our place. But the air felt heavy, charged, as though my wife had something he didn't anticipate. The scene was teetering on a knife's edge, and I could already sense the balance was about to shift. The deputy's words still hung in the air when my wife straightened her shoulders and looked them squarely in the eye. There was no hesitation, no hint of nerves, just the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of knowing exactly how to handle pressure. She repeated what she had already said, that she had changed the lock for security, her tone steady but firm, as if she were explaining something obvious to a classroom full of children. The deputies listened, shifting slightly, their expressions caught between professionalism and disbelief that they'd been called out for something so minor. Then, almost casually, my wife reached into her jacket. The HOA president leaned forward, his smug face tightening with anticipation, no doubt expecting some argument or flimsy paperwork he could shoot down. Instead, she pulled out a small black leather case and flipped it open in one smooth, practiced motion. The sunlight caught the shield inside, gleaming against its holder. Federal law enforcement, her badge. For a moment, everything stopped. The deputies froze mid-breath, their eyes locking on the badge, the recognition flashing instantly across their faces. Their entire posture changed, backs straighter, hands falling from their belts, heads nodding in the kind of silent respect that only comes when one officer acknowledges another. They didn't need to say anything. It was written all over their expressions. They'd been dragged into nonsense, and now they realized exactly who they were dealing with. The HOA president's reaction was almost comical. His smug grin dissolved, replaced with a slack, jawed expression that made him look suddenly very small. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but nothing came out. His hands twitched at his sides, as though he wanted to wave off the moment, to somehow downplay what had just happened, but he couldn't summon the words. He looked like a man who had picked the wrong fight and realized it too late. My wife didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice, didn't even smirk. She just closed the case, slipped it back into her jacket, and said evenly, "Now, is there a problem with me securing my own home?" The deputies shook their heads immediately, their tone shifting to apologetic. The power in the air had flipped completely, and everyone knew it. The silence that followed my wife's words was thick enough to cut with a knife. The two deputies, who only moments earlier had been standing tall and official, suddenly looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. One of them cleared his throat and shifted his weight from one boot to the other, glancing at his partner as if to confirm what they were both thinking. They'd just been dragged into a neighborly squabble that never should have left the HOA meeting room. Their stiff posture softened, and a touch of embarrassment crept into their expressions. The HOA president, however, was frozen in place. The smug confidence he'd carried up to this moment had drained out of him completely. His face, once flushed with self-righteous triumph, now looked pale under the late afternoon sun. His arms, still crossed, sagged slightly as though the strength to hold them there had evaporated. He opened his mouth once, then again, but no sound came out. The man who had summoned law enforcement to flex his authority couldn't muster a single word, now that real authority was standing before him. My wife didn't press him. That was the beauty of it. She didn't need to. She simply held his gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the deputies, giving them the out they were desperately searching for. "Gentlemen," she said evenly, "I appreciate you coming all the way out here, but as you can see, There's no crime in changing the lock on my own door. The deputies nodded quickly, one of them offering a sheepish, "Of course, ma'am. Sorry for the trouble." They both tipped their heads respectfully and took a small step back, already angling toward their cruisers. The relief on their faces was clear. They'd been spared from a confrontation with someone who outranked the petty politics of a homeowners association. The HOA president still lingered, though, rooted to the spot like he'd been caught in a trap. His eyes darted from my wife to the officers, and finally to me, searching for some shred of control to cling to. But there was nothing left for him. His attempt to intimidate had backfired spectacularly, leaving him exposed and powerless. My wife bent down, picked up the box she had set aside earlier, and carried it into the cabin as if the entire exchange had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The message was clear without her ever saying it. The game was over. The deputies didn't linger long after that. With quick, apologetic nods, they retreated to their cruisers, the gravel crunching under their boots as if they couldn't get back to their cars fast enough. A moment later, the engine started up, and the sound of tires rolling down the dirt road carried away what little tension remained. The only one left standing in the wake of the encounter was the HOA president, still awkwardly frozen in place. Without the shield of law enforcement behind him, he suddenly seemed small, diminished, like a balloon losing air. He shifted his weight, muttering something about regulations and miscommunication, though his voice was so low and unconvincing it barely reached us. My wife didn't even bother acknowledging it. She simply picked up another box from the car and carried it inside, her movements deliberate, calm, and entirely unconcerned with him. I followed, suppressing a smile. There was no need for confrontation. The silence and her quiet authority had already delivered the only lesson he needed. Eventually, the president turned on his heel and shuffled down the road, his shoulders rounded as though he carried a weight he hadn't expected. There was no more posturing, no more smug grin, just a man who had overplayed his hand and lost. We watched from the porch as he disappeared between the trees, swallowed up by the winding path of the community road. The mountain air felt lighter somehow, the quiet around the cabin settling back into place. That evening, we sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, the sun sinking behind the ridge and painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. For the first time since we'd arrived, it felt like our cabin, secure, private, and untouched by the petty power games of the HOA. My wife leaned back in her chair, a faint smile on her lips, and said, "Think they'll bother us again?" I laughed softly. Not a chance. And I was right. From that day forward, the HOA left us completely alone. No more lectures about paint colors, no emails about mailbox sizes, no sideways glances when we came into town. Word spread quickly about the woman in the new cabin who had flashed a badge and turned the tables. The president avoided eye contact whenever we crossed paths, and the rest of the board treated us with the wary respect usually reserved for people they knew better than to provoke. The lock stayed just as my wife had installed it, quiet, unchallenged, and a reminder of a line no one dared cross again.